Rules and Administration to order. It is 2:02 p.m. on January 30th. Meeting's called to order. I really appreciate everybody coming together on a Friday afternoon, especially virtually. Not my favorite way for us to meet, but serves our purpose today. We have two things to discuss, both related to capital security. You should have gotten the materials via email in preparation. We also have with us today Council Lexi Stengel, Secretary Tom Bodden, and our Chief Sergeant Sven to help guide us through this, to see if there are questions as we move along that they may be able to answer to inform us before we take a vote. I know that we have been through a lot altogether this year, and there have been a lot of off the record conversations about security in the Capitol since June 14th, and the continued experiences that we're having with gun violence are just renewing people's situational awareness and concern. And so I think it is important that we're having this conversation today and making these motions. With that, I'd like to turn it to Ms. Stengel to walk us through what's before us before we take up the motions. Ms. Stengel.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I believe you'd like to take the policy up first. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Thank you. Members, what you have before you is a new proposed Senate policy. It is proposed to be Senate Policy 8.50, and it is an entirely new policy, although you're used to looking at new language underlined. This is not underlined, but I'll make it clear that this is an entirely new policy, even though none of it appears underlined before you. So it is all new language. I will go through it in a moderate amount of detail because it is all new. So the first thing in the policy is a purpose statement. The purpose of the policy is to keep visitors, senators, and staff safe and secure while in the building. The next part is that the Senate will ban firearms and other dangerous weapons in the Minnesota Senate building. But this does not apply to a person who carries a pistol with if the person has a permit to carry, and it cites the permit to carry statute. In order to enforce this ban, the Senate will implement screening for weapons in entrances or an entrance to the MSB that is designated by the chair of the Rules Committee. Screening will be in effect during regular and special sessions and at other times designated by the chair of this committee. The chair of this committee will also designate which entrance or entrances will have screening and will provide additional guidance on weapons screening procedures. Any of these additional guidance provided by the chair must be consistent with state law. And the final piece of this policy is that this committee may temporarily suspend the policy if funding is not available or for other good cause. And I'll pause there, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Stengel. Secretary Bodden, are you here for questions or do you have something you'd like to add?
Madam Chair, I'm here for questions, just with regard to implementing the policy.
All right, members, this is, of course, a new policy for us, and I want to make sure people have answers to their questions before we take it up. Senator Rest.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. By adopting this policy, do we bind any future Senate positions? I would ask that of Mr. Bodden or Ms. Stengel, or is this considered a permanent proposal absent a future Senate Rules Committee decision otherwise?
Ms. Stengel.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Senator Rest and committee members. In broad strokes, it is more of a permanent policy that once put in place, the screening and the ban on most firearms in the building will be in place unless there are additional actions taken by the Rules Committee. There is some flexibility in the policy with designations given to the chair of the Rules Committee to make some decisions about where the screening will happen and which doors the screening will happen and some of the additional protocols. But to suspend the policy or to change the policy itself, the Rules Committee would need to take further action.
Thank you very much, Ms. Stengel and Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator Rest. Are there other questions about the policy? Senator Limmer, hello.
Hello, thank you. Just a few details. Generally, we don't put purpose in our legislation. I know this is a rule. Was there really a need for that? I would think that the rule is somewhat self-explanatory.
Thank you, Senator Limmer. Ms. Stengel, did you want to talk about this? We talked about it a little bit. We know it is unusual to add a statement of purpose. Ms. Stengel, did you want to address that, please?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. It is somewhat unusual, Senator Limmer, but in discussions that we've had, that I've had with our attorney at the Attorney General's office, it was felt that it was probably a good idea to make it very clear what the purpose of this, what the intent of this policy was. So it was probably best to put it into the policy.
Yeah. The other question I had was the cost. What is there a cost and how is it covered and what appropriation are we relying on?
Thank you, Senator Limmer. I'm going to turn to Secretary Bodden for this to begin.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Senator Limmer. So there are two principal categories of costs. There's the equipment necessary to do the screening. That is, purchase of scanning equipment for the designated entrance. That would be paid for from the carry forward account, which is part of, as I'm sure you know, an existing account based on amounts available at the end of the previous biennium, the amounts that remain in the appropriation. The cost for staffing the weapons screening system is, while yet to be precisely determined, would be paid for from the Senate's general fund appropriation. It could, if necessary, come from the carry forward account as well. But these costs would come from Senate funds, which is my understanding at this point. Obviously, some of the personnel involved will be from Capitol Security, and Capitol Security is charged with providing security for the legislature. So there may be some room for change in that, but at this point, just from a budget perspective, for the remainder of the biennium, I'm working with existing amounts available in appropriations to the Senate.
Madam
Senator Limmer.
The other question I had was, could someone tell me what the cost of metal detector is?
Secretary Bodden.
Madam Chair and Senator Limmer, and the weapons screening system that we have gathered more information about and contracted for is produced by a company called Evolve. I don't have the exact dollar amount at my fingertips here. It is just slightly a few thousand more than 100,000 as in a contractual agreement paid in 4 annual installments.
Is this something that we should buy or is it something that perhaps we should rent? And as improvements to technology continue, I'd hate to keep buying a new one all the time. Do they provide for a rental?
Secretary Bodden.
Madam Chair and Senator Limmer, our sergeant has been very diligent in reviewing the options available to us. And if my answer is incomplete, I'll ask that he be permitted to supplement. It is extraordinarily difficult to find any kind of a short-term lease for a weapons screening system. Evolve doesn't do that. What I will tell you and becomes apparent is that the technology does evolve to the point that the 4-year purchase agreement, in a sense, is a kind of lease. These systems are, continuously evolving. So you can, in one sense, think about it as a $25,000 a year lease.
Thank you, Secretary Bodden. Sergeant Lindquist, do you have anything that you'd like to add? I know you've been spending a fair amount of time on this.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee. the principal company does not lease this equipment, so it's through an additional party. And one of the quotes that I got, I'll use the term exorbitant, to try to get a unit for roughly 120 days. They don't do it that way. They weren't happy to provide that quote, but it almost equaled the purchase price for that lease period. I was shocked at those numbers. And to that end, it made sense, in my recommendation to the secretary and Leader Murphy was that it only made sense from this investment standpoint for that roughly $25,000 a year to go down that road and in that direction, and we would have the equipment on site. If we were to prepare for the 2027 session, we'd have it and not be in this situation again.
Thank you, Sergeant Lindquist. Leader Johnson.
Thank you, Leader Murphy. And this question is for Ms. Stengel. Ms. Stengel, when you described the resolution itself, it sounded like the chair at their sole discretion had some latitude or authority to change requirements and different things. Could you just speak to that if I've got that right, and kind of what the guardrails would be on those?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Madam Chair and Senator Johnson. So the main pieces of the policy are sort of established within the policy and are unable to be changed by the chair. So that would be the fact that screening will be in place and the fact that firearms and dangerous weapons will be banned with the exception of permit holders. So those pieces are in the policy and cannot be changed by the chair. The things that can be, the powers that are given to the chair are the chair gets to designate which entrance or entrances have the screening systems, and then additional procedures or policies for screening. So that would be, for example, how are we going to implement this, the day-to-day sort of operational pieces, for example. And then there's one other piece that's sort of left to the committee, which would be a sort of temporary suspension. For example, if there wasn't funding or there was another good cause and this committee decided we want to temporarily suspend this for some amount of time. And that's the whole committee, not just the chair.
Leader Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And so the specifics within that, the right now permit to purchase or permit to carry holders are exempt from this rule. There isn't any latitude then within the chair or the sole discretion to change those sorts of parameters. That's clear, right? Ms. Stengel, I'm sorry.
Madam Chair and Senator Johnson, you are correct. If you look at the policy, there is a provision, it's a standalone paragraph in the policy that says the Senate bans firearms and other dangerous weapons in the Minnesota Senate building, except for the ban does not apply to a person who carries a pistol according to the terms of a permit issued under, and then it cites the statute. And then it goes on to talk about enforcing the bans and weapons screening. And then that's where it gets into the part where the chair has discretion. So no, the chair would not be able to, on the chair's own discretion, be able to amend or change how the ban on firearms is implemented and say, change it unilaterally to apply to people that carry under a permit.
Leader Johnson.
I'm good. Thank you, Leader Murphy.
Thank you, Leader Johnson. Senator Pappas.
On this same line of discussion, so people who have legal permits, will then they be required to show their permit upon entrance to the Senate building?
Ms. Stengel.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I can give you my best understanding of this, and Sergeant Lindquist can maybe jump in here. But it's my understanding that when somebody presents themselves to the screening, if they have a firearm, a licensed police officer, which would be the state trooper, would then ask if they have a permit, and they'd be asked to present that permit.
Sergeant Lindquist, do you have anything to add?
Madam Chair, Senator Pappas, that is my understanding. That when either somebody leaves because they have a weapon on them, or they declare it. And at that point, the trooper assigned to that station will have that conversation and look at the permit, make sure it's valid.
And
That's
if
it.
they don't declare it, the metal detector would pick it up.
Correct.
Right.
Thank you, Senator Pappas. Senator.
I have to declare my hips when I go through metal detectors. They're considered weapons, I guess, but they're definitely metal.
Thank you, Senator Pappas. Okay. Senator Marty.
Just a quick operational question, Madam Chair, with the garage, which I believe what I read was that there's going to be basically one entrance other than those coming from the Capitol and so on underground, but the main entrance and then other entrances would be in effect closed even to card holders. And that's question one. Question two is in the garage. I presume members or staff who may have permits to carry could bring in things in through the garage. They would not be screened. How is that dynamic? I guess I'm wondering how that dynamic works out in terms of people entering the building that way, because other guests come in the building, people with disabilities, that's disability parking, other thing. I guess I'm questioning how that works, how that gate works.
Thanks, Senator Marty. We appreciate that we are acknowledging our staff and our members who come in through that parking garage are trusted members of our organization. They are known to us. They are coming through two badge entries. And so those who have a permit to carry, and this policy doesn't apply to our members, will be able to come in that way. We have right now one entry point, and it's a southwest entry point identified, but one of the reasons that there is some flexibility in this policy is to make sure that as we're implementing it, if we have to make changes, not to the policy itself, but to the implementation, that we're able to do this. And I think there will be, and I am not a security expert, but there will be, I think, growing pains, if you will. We will all have to learn how to navigate through the buildings, through the tunnels, et cetera, to conduct the work of the legislature, given the executive order and the establishment of this policy for the Senate building.
Madam Chair, thank you. Wasn't questioning about how, because I assume if a Senate staff or a Senate member has a permit and is carrying, that they would be aware of they would know that they would presumably have a permit with them or whatever, but once they're in the building, that's fine. My concern wasn't to the senators and staff, it was we do use the parking ramp for other people as well. I think specifically, usually invited guests or people with disabilities, and I just wonder if there's any thought to that, or if that's one of the growing pains we'll figure out as we go.
I know there has been consideration. I'm just not sure, especially around the disability entrance, that we have finalized the plan there.
Thank you.
Okay. Senator Limmer.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Senator Marty's discussion kind of raises a point when we think that we can stop all threats by the use of technology. We've got a glaring hole in the garage. We've could have a disgruntled employee that doesn't even have a concealed carry permit. I'm more concerned about that type of person. And then getting access to the building. So I'm a bit concerned about that. And I'll just leave it there, but also I was talking about costs first, about the equipment, but then there's also the cost of manning the machine. And I know it takes more than one person to operate it, maybe even up to 3, possibly 4. I'm not sure. I've had this discussion because I'm a member on the Capitol Security Committee, and we've been having this discussion as well. I still haven't gotten figures from them during the proposal they have reviewed. And so we increased trooper presence at the Capitol when we knew that we couldn't, due to budget constraints, we couldn't go down the road of metal detectors. So we increased the trooper complement in anticipation that, we just think that we arrived at the conclusion that we needed more troopers, especially during the Senate sessions. So is there a cost estimate on the troopers? And then what budget does that come out of? Does that come out of the judiciary budget with DPS, or does it come out of the highway department with their costs for troopers? I'd like to know a little bit more about that if someone could share that with me.
Yeah, thanks, Senator Loomer. I'm going to turn to Secretary Bodden and then to Sergeant Lindquist, who just met with DPS again yesterday. Secretary Bodden.
So, Madam Chair and Senator Limmer, I'll get started by saying I think some of these things are still in discussion to the extent that Capitol Security, and by that I include, what the State Patrol, the troopers that we often speak of, and Capitol Security officers, CSOs, sometimes known as blue shirts, those staff provided from the Department of Public Safety would be or could be the cost of compensation could come from the DPS budget. I don't think that it's from highway funds. I'm not an expert in that area. I know there are constitutional restrictions on how those dollars can be used and don't believe any of them are used for Capitol Security. There is also the possibility of some form of interagency agreement in a temporary sense where those costs are offset to a certain extent, but that is still in discussion. And just to comment on one earlier point that you made, I think, and I'll allow the sergeant to fill in on this, but you're looking at a minimum of 3 staff per weapons screening point. And like you said, likely 4 in some instances, depending, I think, on how busy that point of entry is. I'm sorry I can't give you a more precise answer to your question at this point, but you are correct. There are personnel costs involved. Obviously, some of that within DPS could be shifting resources where troopers are deployed and so forth, not necessarily a new appropriation.
Madam Chair, the other question that comes up is the hours that someone would be manning that. We go quite late sometimes, or there are personnel in the building late, researchers, legislators, where even after hours, they're still there. Have we had any discussion about how long someone would be manning that? And if they were not, are we locking down the building? Could someone come in and hide an implement of some sort later on in the evening to use later, a day or two later? I hope we've had this type of discussion because it's necessary if you're going to protect a building. You have to review every possible option you can think of, and we're already finding issues that reveal weakness.
I appreciate this, Senator Limmer, and I'm grateful that you're on the Capitol Security Advisory Committee because that committee is doing some of the legwork here. It will be the case, I believe, that we will staff the screening points and perhaps, especially in the earlier part of the session, end at a certain point of the day. And if there's a hearing that happens after that point of the day, perhaps it will be virtual rather than in person. Because I don't think it's going to work to have the 2 blue shirts and a trooper 24 hours a day. And so we're going to have to do some adjusting to make that work. I also find it, the point that you're making about someone could put something in the building, that's already the case. And we're going to have to, work with one another's expertise as we move forward through this implementation to catch each other on ideas like that or hypotheticals like that. so that we're doing the best we can together to make sure that the people can participate in our government and the people who are coming into the facilities can participate safely. And that is, of course, the overarching goal of this policy. I'd also like then to turn to, again, Sergeant Lindquist, who I know has recently met again with the Department of Public Safety for an update.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Senator Limmer, I spent an hour and a half with the troopers that you're familiar with, Captain Roski, Captain Flynn, this morning. And to say that there are more questions than answers at this point would probably be an understatement. They were given an executive order and not a lot else to go on. And so these details are being discussed. And I certainly hope that we start to get some coalescing and congealing next week as the runway is getting shorter all the time. Your comments are well taken. They're a part of the mix. They're part of the discussion. And I'm certainly pleased to hear Leader Murphy's comments about the potential for a little bit different conduct of business after hours, because it's correct. I mean, Capitol Security is a 24-hour-a-day operation, but to have that scheduled, they're committed for normal business hours and as needed or necessary. I think when required, they'll be there. But there is a cost to that. And just to comment on Secretary Bodden's answer about the financial piece of this on the fiscal side, I've been not involved in that. We've been dealing with the details of implementation, location, all that sort of thing. And I trust that State Patrol brass is working out the specifics of cost and how the billing will be passed on.
Thank you, Sergeant Lindquist. And I will just add one more point on the cost. And the cost part of this is we learned that the governor was going to proceed with an executive order and began to have conversations about the Senate building that has 3 significant hearing rooms for the public, and the need to extend the policy to our building to create the same perimeter of safety for the public as well as for everybody who works in the building. The Department of Public Safety was, pretty abundantly clear that the resources available were not rich, which is why we're beginning with Senate funds. But I've already spoken with Mr. Nauman, Eric Nauman. If this is a policy that is proceeding for us, then I think we have to think about how we're including the funding in the legislature's budget going forward, and not just in the Senate's specific budget, because this is, I would imagine, something that we will continue to carry. We may change our minds, but if this is something that we implement going forward in a more permanent fashion, then there's got to be an appropriation for that. That is in keeping with what we're doing with the Capitol itself, and eventually for the House building that will be populated one day with members and staff there as well. Senator Limmer, do you have another question?
I do, Madam Chair. According to state law, concealed carry weapon permit holder, that information is considered under data privacy laws as private. When a police officer would ask for that identification, usually it's a one-on-one discussion, perhaps at a traffic stop. It's basically a somewhat private interchange. But asking for a permit in a public setting where there may be people there, it may be revealing the identity of a concealed carry weapon permit holder in the public. I've spoken to some people that frequent the building on a regular basis. They're female. They have concealed carry permits because they work late as lobbyists in the buildings, and they travel from one building to another, oftentimes toward the end of the session, late in the evening. And they're very concerned that a constant asking for permit would eventually reveal that they are carriers of a concealed carry weapon. And if anything, if they ever were threatened, they might be the very first people they would be targeted because of them carrying. So I hope there's some discretion and a discrete process that would be employed by the staff of these metal detectors so that a carrier would not necessarily be known to the public because it really puts them in danger. That's the only comment I have, Madam Chair. I hope as we continue this discussion and as things get implemented, that that's a very real concern.
Thank you, Senator Limmer. I appreciate that. And yes, we can address that. We will work to address that. Senator Marty.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I just want to make a comment that I think this is a big step forward, a good step forward. And second, what you said a few minutes ago about how there were going to be speed bumps along the way as we try and figure these things out. And as I think none of us are thinking that this is the end all and be all for security. And it doesn't mean it's not inexpensive and everything else. Last summer, we very quickly gave all legislators household security. I guess I'm glad. I wish we didn't have to have it, but I guess I'm glad we have it. But do I feel, wow, I'm safe now? No, of course not. It's one part of it, and this is another part of it. And no, we should not assume that there aren't ways somebody could defeat the system and everything else. I think this does make us safer, and I applaud those who are bringing this forward.
Thank you, Senator Marty. Are there other questions? I want to make sure we've responded to everybody's questions before we take up the motion. Okay, seeing no further questions, I'd entertain a motion on adopting the Minnesota Senate Building Security Policy. Senator Pappas.
I'll move that.
Senator Pappas moves adoption of the Minnesota Senate Building Security Policy as we have discussed in this meeting. Are there any questions? Seeing no questions, all those in favor, please say aye.
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 And those opposed say no.
No.
Hearing the voice votes here and understanding there was probably one no vote, the motion is adopted. Thank you, members. I'd like to move to the second matter before us, which is the committee resolution reflecting and adopting or endorsing, if you will, Senator Champion's letter regarding the gallery. And again, turn to Ms. Stengel for explanation. Ms. Stengel.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Before you, you should have the committee resolution 018 that references the letter that President Champion issued earlier this week. I believe in your virtual packets, you should also have a copy of that letter. The resolution in the first paragraph, lines 5 through 8, references that letter and the protocols for the Senate chamber, including security scanners and the prohibition of all firearms and dangerous weapons. And in the second paragraph, lines 9 and 10, provides that the Committee on Rules and Administration endorses those protocols implemented by the January 26th letter.
Thank you, Ms. Stengel. Senator Champion.
Thank you, Madam. Madam Chair. As Council indicated, my letter was sent out and to you all and to the public on January 26, 2026. It outlines the authority, but from my vantage point, getting support from the Rules Committee is an important step to creating safety in the Senate gallery. This ban would start on the day of session and would only be active from my understanding, on those days that we are in session. And then once session is over, it is my understanding that it will not apply. But in the event that I'm in error, Senate Council can correct me. In that letter also is the rationale that is outlined in the letter. And I'll highlight some of the points made in the letter. So I won't go through each one line by line, but the first thing from my vantage point is the increased political violence that we are seeing, and that it feels chaotic and unsettling and unsafe. If you think about the chamber's gallery, that means individuals are above. We as legislators and staff are in a bowl. If someone was to unfortunately think or do something that we'd hope they wouldn't, we would all be at their mercy, because that's where we all would be sitting in that bowl. So I want legislators, staff who show up to do their job, to be and feel safe. You may have also heard that the other day, I was at a town hall meeting and a person lodged some substance at Congresswoman Omar and myself, because I was sitting to the right there, and I was sitting there with other electeds. And as we sat in that room, as you see from it being widely publicized, that that person, lodged an act that we all felt very uncomfortable about. And not to mention the substance at that moment, we didn't know what it was, right? It could have, or what if it was, something like acid or something else. But the whole idea is that there seems to be this mindset that unfortunately that we have to take some precautions around. There's another example that I'll give you that is of interest. If you remember last summer, there was the person who got into the Capitol and got into the Senate gallery and appeared to jump down from the Senate gallery down into our area as legislators. In fact, the person sat in my chair or the president's chair at least 3 or 4 times and was there, didn't have any clothes on. But the question is, for me, with people doing things that I feel so unsettled about, what if all 67 senators and the front desk staff and Senate staff were present and the person entered with worse ideas, like a firearm? Now, I think that this also balances the right to bear firearms. I'm not one who, goes after the Second Amendment and don't want people to carry if that's what they want to do, but we want to make sure that it's legal and done well. But the Second Amendment is not absolute, and there's some limitations to carry in sensitive spaces like legislative assemblies. And so this is one of those times that I believe that we need to strike the balance of protecting all of us, including our staff, and also acknowledging respect for the Constitution, for the Second Amendment. So I would hope that we could get support for this for the resolution that is before this body. I just think that it sends a real solid message that we want to make sure that each person, every staff person, is safe. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thanks, Senator Champion. President Champion. Questions? I see Senator Rest.
Thank you, Madam Chair. To make sure that we have this proposal on the table, I would make a motion that the Senate Rules Committee adopt it and then proceed with discussion before we vote on it. So that would be my motion at this point.
Right. Senator Rest moves the committee resolution. So it is before us for discussion. And just to be really clear here, we would be endorsing the action already taken by President Champion.
That is correct.
Thank you. Motion before us, Senator Pappas.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members. as a former Senate president, I certainly agree with President Champion that you don't really know what's going on above your head. And it can be a very disorienting experience to not understand that and to have that sense of insecurity. And I know I've heard from other members who have also chaired the chamber that they also are really concerned about that. So I think this is a good idea to have more control over the galleries. We don't want to not allow visitors in because it's an experience, to maybe a boring experience, but it's an experience to observe the legislature in action. But we need to know that we're safe.
Thank you, Senator Pappas. Senator Johnson. You're still on mute, Leader Johnson.
I sound better on mute, so it's probably better anyways.
I want to hear
Thank
your
you.
big accent.
Thank you, Madam Leader. Appreciate it. And I appreciate the underpinning of the resolution itself too. But the examples and the arguments that were made for this by Senator Champion on that, the syringe full of a substance that was unknown, then also the gentleman that was going through the mental health crisis that broke in there. This rule would not address those issues that we've had. And to go further, when Senator Champion spoke about not going after constitutional rights that we do have with the Second Amendment, this also goes after some of our statutory rights within Minnesota State statute that's in there as well too. So it really does beg a legal challenge to be presented on these things as well too. So however much, I understand the discomfort that we might have of what's going on in the gallery at that time. I think we've given some very good examples of we can't control all that happens up there. Plus with the new EO, I think that's addressed a number of those concerns that we already, is already underpinning this particular resolution. So unless something else comes of this discussion, I'm not in the position where I can really support this one.
Thank you, Leader Johnson. Senator Rest and then Senator Champion, or Senator Champion, did you want to respond? Perhaps that's right.
I did. Thank you, Madam Chair. What I've outlined really is about the mindset and what is going on in our society today and how that mindset exposes us in the most vulnerable, sensitive place where we all gather in order to do the people's work. So Senator Johnson can say that it will not prevent a person from doing something with a syringe or a person jumping down. The whole idea is that we want to take the necessary precautions to avoid any deadly opportunities that people can be given in order to harm the 67 senators along with their staff and other desk staff. That is the point. It is not tit for tat. And yes, and Senator Johnson's a lawyer. He knows that the Second Amendment is not absolute. If someone wants to bring litigation, they certainly can do that. But we would hope that Senator Johnson and others would see the importance of the balancing act that we're putting forward, or that I'm putting forward, and not in a way to hinder or to create a barrier, but really full of the whole notion of keeping us all safe. So thank you for the opportunity to speak again, Madam Leader.
Thank you, President Champion. Senator Rest.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I certainly agree with the presentation and the arguments and the rationale that Senator Champion has put forward. We're not talking about spitting at someone. We're not talking about a syringe of vinegar sitting to a person who is sitting next to you. We are talking about someone who is intent on harming the members below. And you can't do that with a syringe. You possibly can do it with other means, but you certainly can do it with firing a gun or a pistol. And that is by limiting access to the gallery, we eliminate an extremely important possibility that one of us would be harmed and possibly lose our lives. With regard to my motion, Madam Chair, I also would request a roll call.
Senator Rest, requests a roll call. When we proceed to the vote, we will do it with a roll call vote. Are there other questions or comments? Senator Johnson, Leader Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And not to speak up again, but I just, to get the order right on this. So the governor has put out the executive order earlier this week in which only those with a permit to carry are allowed to be on the Capitol grounds and in the Capitol. Is that, do I have the understanding of that correct? And maybe Ms. Stengel would be the appropriate ask on that one, if I may.
Ms. Stengel.
Madam Chair and Senator Johnson, that is my understanding that that is how the ban will be implemented in the Capitol building.
Thank you. And Madam Chair.
Leader Johnson.
So they've already been screened prior to coming into our visitors area up in the gallery and the hallway, wherever that may be set up. So by saying that additionally to, they are licensed as per our Minnesota state statute, as per our understanding of the Second Amendment, now we're saying that you can no longer be welcomed into the gallery with your permitted firearm. Is that correct? And I think Ms. Stengel will probably be the appropriate ask on that.
Ms. Stengel.
Madam Chair and Senator Johnson, that is correct.
Thank you, Madam Chair. That's all my questions.
Thank you, Leader Johnson. Senator Miller.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have a question for Ms. Stengel or Mr. Bodden, either one. Do we feel, or do you feel that this is statutorily legal as well as constitutionally legal to do this?
Ms. Stengel.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Senator Miller. For all of the reasons you've heard from many of the members that have various opinions on this, there are statutes, as you're well aware, that allow people to have a permit to carry. But there are also a line of cases from the U.S. Supreme Court that allow sensitive places to be, to the government to permit, sorry, getting my words all confused here. There is a line of court cases from the Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court, that allow the government to ban all firearms in sensitive places like schools and legislative assemblies and those sorts of things. So without going too far into the conversations I've had with the Attorney General's office, because I don't want to compromise our attorney-client privilege here, I think that there is a strong argument that the Senate the Senate gallery is a sensitive place, as outlined in the letter from Senator Champion, based on those Supreme Court precedents, and therefore can ban firearms in the Senate gallery.
Senator Miller.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So am I understanding this correctly that law-abiding citizens who have a permit to carry under this scenario would be able to carry a firearm in the Capitol, but then within the Capitol, they would not be able to enter the Senate gallery and oversee or watch the Senate proceedings? Am I understanding that correctly, Madam Chair?
Madam Chair and Senator Miller, they would not be able to watch the proceedings from the Senate gallery.
Okay, and Madam Chair, one more question. So under this proposal, if a law-abiding citizen who has a permit to carry attempts to enter the gallery, they'll either be they'll be just, is it scenario one, they'll be turned away and they're not allowed if they have a firearm, or is there's no place for them to store their firearm while they view that, right? So they're just turned away, is that correct?
Senator Miller, yes, we do not have in the Minnesota Senate building or in the gallery right now a place for storage, so they would be turned away. Senator Champion?
And thank you, Madam Chair. And to Senator Miller's question, one of the things that I thought about and others thought about is the fact that they still will be able to watch proceedings without going into a sensitive area, because we have monitors in the Capitol. And in fact, we see different people watching those monitors every single session. And they're able to talk to us and communicate with us, get us any information. The only thing that's happening here is saying, here's a sensitive area where there's full exposure of all of us in a sensitive, that puts us all in a sensitive position. Individuals who are lawfully carrying, they can come into the Capitol. They are welcome. And they are welcome to come and watch the monitors or be any other places, committee rooms, anything of that nature. So thank you.
Senator Miller?
Madam Chair, thank you. So I'm not necessarily opposed, but I have more questions, and I would really feel more comfortable getting some additional input from folks that have a little bit more knowledge about this than I do. So again, I'm not necessarily opposed to it today. I'll be a no vote, but it's something that I just think needs more discussion.
Thank you, Senator Miller. Senator Frantz?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, members. I'll be a yes vote on this as well. We want less people to be shot. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator Frantz. Senator Limmer?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Have we started any conversation with individuals that are concealed carry permit holders and to determine if they have an opinion on this action?
Thank you, Senator Limmer. I have not had a conversation with, for instance, the Gun Owners Caucus on this topic. I am certain that there will be a conversation. I'll just speak for myself.
If I could request the same question from the author of this policy, Senator Champion. Have you had any discussion with people who carry weapons concealed via permit?
Madam Chair, and Senator Limmer, I have, Senator Limmer, so I'm glad that you asked that question. I have not talked to the Gun Caucus, but I have talked to individuals who conceal and carry. In fact, before my father passed, he was a proud gun owner. So leading up to this, I've talked to a cross section of different people because I wanted to get their thoughts and opinions as to how this might impact them, and really look at the balance that we were attempting to strike here. And they said that they thought it was a good balance because they could watch the monitor if they wanted to. They could still enter the Capitol, but they understand the sensitivity of someone being in the gallery and how we're all sitting in that bowl. And so they were okay with it. So thank you for the question, Senator Limmer.
Madam Chair.
Senator Limmer.
I think I would have enjoyed the conversation as well if I would have been given the opportunity to do that. If I could direct our attention back to the cost factor that I had raised before, I'm assuming the cost for the equipment would be from the same Senate sources that was quoted to me in the earlier policy. Again, we're moving troopers and other security personnel from the Capitol or elsewhere in the Capitol, I'm assuming, or are we adding complement that would increase the budget? Could someone clarify?
Secretary Bodden.
Madam Chair and Senator Limmer, you're correct that the analysis for this additional weapon screening for the gallery is and description of how this would work basically is, very similar to how this would work for the entrance to the Senate building. To your point about the staffing from the Department of Public Safety, troopers and Capitol Security officers, you're right, there is a decision to make about how they're deployed or whether additional personnel are needed. But yeah, I don't really have much further to add here than I did than what I told you previously concerning the Senate building screening.
Madam Chair, I'd be a little concerned if we're drawing troopers that were on duty to secure the Capitol. What are we exposing if we take troopers from one location of the Capitol building or complex to man the weapon detector? And I know there's lobbyists that like to follow from the gallery. Some of them are concealed carry holders, and they have made comment to me, there's no place to put the weapon away. There's no locker system that we have, and they would have to find a secure lockbox in their vehicle or somewhere else, which would then expose them to outside threat by walking back sometimes late at night from the neighborhood. So these are all
He's got a
considerations
trooper to
that I
walk
hope,
with them.
Was someone interrupting me? Guess not. Madam Chair, I was just stating that I hope we don't create more exposure by people trying to manage this policy. I think it can be managed. I think we can find an answer to all of this, but right now, the way it's written, I think it creates some possible exposure.
Thank you, Senator Limmer. I do want to say, in addition to the conversation that we're having right now, over the course of the fall, I've been in an ongoing conversation with the Department of Public Safety and with Secretary Bodden, and you will see an increase in both state troopers and security sergeants, both in the Capitol and in the Senate building, as a result of the political violence that we've experienced in Minnesota over the last number of months. And the idea of a trooper serving in this role is a deployment of a trooper, but with knowledge, with the additional complement that is already coming to the public space of the Capitol and the Minnesota Senate building because of what we've experienced. So I do want to, I want to call our attention to this. There have been a number of things that have happened since June 14th with regard to member security in their homes, member security online, member security in the Senate building. That's already taken place with the additional staff that have been deployed through the course of the fall in the Senate building and the additional troopers that we will see while we're in session. So the executive order coming from the governor has added an additional layer, and we are working through the implementation of that. But there has been a commitment to the deployment of additional security staff to the legislature for this session that predated that executive order. And we will see that presence in our hearing rooms and in the Capitol itself. Senator Champion, do you have your hand up for a purpose? Senator
I do,
Champion?
and I'll be brief, Madam Chair. A couple things. Senator Limmer asked me earlier, had I talked to any other permit holders, and I indicated that I did, which is true. Not only did I talk to those permit holders, I also talked to people who are lobbyists. And in fact, there were a couple of things that the lobbyists raised to me. One was that they are feeling increasingly unsafe if there are not safety measures implemented at the Capitol. One lobbyist talked about not just for their personal safety, but even their staff, and that they would have to talk about a potential liability if they're sending individuals into the Capitol and we haven't taken the necessary precautions in order to keep them and their staff safe. Chair Murphy was right. This is all as a result of June 14th. I didn't think I needed to mention June 14th when I was talking earlier, and I recognize that one of my colleagues here just talked about the two other examples without, thinking about the June 14th notion. And when I also talked to the lobbyists about what I was thinking about doing, and they said they thought it was a good idea. And in fact, what they also said is lobbyists rarely, if ever, go to the gallery. Usually they're on the second floor watching the monitors and are able to watch all the proceedings from there. And if they are a permit holder and they have their weapon with them, they can still be able to do that. But I just wanted to point that out because I wanted to just address a couple of things that happened and just to further illustrate my discussion with a cross section of people and the feedback that I've been getting. Thank you so much.
Thank you, President Champion. Senator Rest.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Senator Champion, for your most recent comment. Perhaps more than any of the rest of you on this call, I remembered June 14th and how close I came to losing my life. So that should not be the determination of anyone else's vote. It certainly is not of mine alone, but it certainly does come to mind when we consider the preciousness of the lives that were lost on that day, and also those who were wounded and who have, in my mind, a miracle occurred by their recovery. And I would hope we would all just hold that in our minds as we take our vote on this motion without making judgments on one another, but respecting the experiences that all of us have had, not only since June 14th, but on June 14th, of what is happening in our beloved state. Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator Rest. Are there further questions? Let me just say one more time that Senator Champion, President Champion, has already instituted this policy, and the action today on this committee resolution is to endorse it. Senator Rest has moved committee resolution reflecting Senator Champion's letter on the Senate gallery security. A roll call has been requested. Is the clerk ready to take the roll?
I am, thank you.
Please proceed.
On the motion, Senator Murphy, how do you vote?
Aye.
Senator Johnson?
No.
Senator Champion? Senator Champion?
Sorry about that. I had my mute on. Aye.
Senator Coleman?
No.
Senator Frentz?
Aye.
Senator Limmer?
No.
Senator Marty?
Aye.
Senator Miller?
No.
Senator Pappas?
Aye.
And Senator Rest?
Yes, indeed.
Thank you. By a vote of 6-4, the motion is adopted. The resolution, I should say, is adopted. Thank you, members. I really appreciate the content of this discussion, and I know that we have work to do together to make sure that we're able to operate safely and openly together. Thank you for the content of the discussion. Seeing no other issues before the Rules Committee today, this meeting is adjourned. Thank you.